Good afternoon. It's 4:05 in the Monterey Bay Area, and KMFO Talk Radio presents Forum, a look at topics and issues of interest around the Monterey Bay Area. Today, Forum's special guest is Mae Brussell. And now here's the host of today's Forum, John Arlen.
Welcome to the KMFO Forum. Today's guest, as we said before, is Mae Brussell of Carmel. She's a student of the Kennedy assassination, Watergate, and the other excesses of the ruling class. Mae, let's just get started into how you got into this thing to start with. Was it the Kennedy assassination that got you hepped up over this?
Yes, it was when John Kennedy, not the day Kennedy was murdered, but 2 days later when Lee Harvey Oswald was murdered. That's when I got interested. When Jack Ruby shot him and in the jail, and they wrestled with Ruby on the ground there, and people were saying, who is he, who is he? And somebody made the remark, oh, all the police know him, or something like that. So that reference, everyone knows who he is around town, that's Jack Ruby. And there was something about just killing this person who had said for 2 days he didn't kill anybody, and then he's shot in the custody of the police. That's when my curiosity started.
Well, then, of course, after that was the famous Warren Commission study, which brought up more questions than it answered.
Well, they didn't bring up the questions. The Warren Commission was appointed because all around the world there were accounts thinking it was a conspiracy in America, particularly after the shooting of Oswald. And the original plan, the legal plan at the time, was that the state of Texas would investigate. It wasn't considered a federal crime. And John Connally was the governor, so the state of Texas would investigate it and it would all be over. But there was so much outrage around the world that it was a conspiracy. The Warren Commission was appointed to investigate it, but in the interim, they were appointed in December, and they started their hearings around February, and they didn't turn in a report till September. So from November 23rd until September, the next year, there were many, many questions that private individuals, and there were no muckrakers like there are now, but certain lawyers were asking, like Mark Lane, and people from Europe, Joey Jost, and writers and newspaper writers were asking questions. That's when the questions came out, up till the time the book came out, and then the president, Lyndon Johnson, said, here are all the answers, and Harrison Salisbury for the New York Times wrote an introduction. There are 4 copies of the book, one put out by the New York Times, and he said anybody who questions it is mentally sick. And Louis Nizer wrote one introduction, almost saying the same thing. You have to be deranged if you question this. So the report came out, and it didn't answer the questions that had been asked for the 9 months before it was published.
Yes, it seems to me that the assassination itself was rather interesting. In the first place, in order to prevail on the assassination, the route had to be known down to, where the president's car was going, and as I recall, that wasn't released till an hour or two before the motorcade, was it? Well,
officially it wasn't, but Lee Harvey Oswald worked, he got a job at a printing office, Jagger's Chili Stovall, and the man who got him that job was George de Mohrenschildt, who was a suspect as a Nazi war criminal by the FBI during World War II, and his wife said, they confirmed later he was a Nazi, never gone to court, but was always a suspect. And he got Oswald the job at a printing company that did government bonds and maps of Cuba and government maps. And Oswald was at the agency, the Saul Bloom agency that decided the motorcade route. He was there over several hundred times as a delivery boy. And de Mohrenschildt also got him the job through Ruth Payne in the Texas School Book Depository. So if we were to be a patsy, they located him in these 2 strategic places so that the route was known by the people later who turned out to be part of the assassination.
The situation when it happened, in other words, the timing for the assassination, even for Oswald to have pulled it off, had to be quite good. He had to be able to pull 3 shots very, very quickly on a weapon that they seem to have proved that couldn't be done.
That's right.
Then, just recently, didn't the Congress make a study concerning the noises, the tapes on the radio?
Well, there wasn't any piece of evidence, really. The gun couldn't shoot that many bullets in the amount of time, and there were sounds of other bullets, and John Connally's clothing was sent to a dry cleaner so they couldn't tell the direction of where the gunman stood, and John Kennedy's clothing was locked up, and the bullet particles that were retrieved were greater than the amount that was out of bullet 399, the one that was supposed to have done the damage. It was pristine and new. And the particles that they found in the body of John Connolly exceeded what was missing even from the bullet. So if you go down the line, there wasn't a piece of physical evidence in the Kennedy assassination that matched the conclusion.
We're talking with Mae Brussell on the KMFO Forum today. If you'd like to join our conversation, the numbers are 688-5804 and 475-5527. Now, the Kennedy assassination is over, and they come up with Lee Harvey Oswald to be the patsy or to be the guy that did it. And he's in jail and claims that he didn't shoot anybody.
That's right.
And they were delivering, where were they taking him out of the basement of the police department?
They didn't have to move him. It was just 48 hours afterwards. They allegedly were going to take him to another police department, another jail, which they announced publicly on television and radio so everyone could be there if they wanted. It was an open invitation to watch him being moved.
And so then the giant watcher was Jack Ruby.
So Jack Ruby gets a telephone call. He's in his room with his roommate in Texas, and he gets a call from a woman who was a stripper at the club who allegedly wants some money sent to her from Fort Worth to 20 miles away nearby. So he goes to Western Union, which just happens to be across the street from the police station. You can see the window upstairs where they're going to move Oswald. I was there in Texas, and the Western Union's across. So if Jack Ruby times it to a certain time, they can start removing him from the top of the jail down to the elevator, synchronized, because they can see when Ruby goes into Western Union. So he just walks right in to the basement, and no guards or anybody stop him, and he has a gun, and there are even some allegations, theories that he came in from another place and not the ramp. There are two interesting ideas about it. But the fact that he gets a phone call, then puts a gun in his pocket, you don't need a gun to make a telegram to send money to somebody. So George Senator, his roommate, said something to the effect he's going out to kill somebody. He gets a phone call, he puts a gun in his pocket, he goes to make a Western Union call and has made arrangements the day before that someone in California should take his dogs, and he calls people in Illinois and says he's leaving California. He's making all physical arrangements to leave the state of Texas and just to make a telephone call.
This is a rather interesting thing. So then he proceeds to the basement of the police department and shoots in front of television audience.
That's right. So when they see him, if you look at the building of the jail where they're upstairs, they could wait any time they want, and when Jack Ruby leaves the Western Union and comes across the street, you take the elevator down with Oswald. People say, well, how would you time it? Well, that's how you time it. I spent 9 years just cross-filing the Warren Commission, the 26 volumes that the government printed, and reading the books that came out in the meantime in those 9 years, and every article that was out. And after spending that time, before I wrote an article or went on the air, I went through 26 volumes, every single page.
So then we have three events that are almost Kafka-ish. I mean, ridiculous. The president is shot going through Dallas. The person that does it, ostensibly, is captured after a chase through a movie theater and a whole bunch of other places that are really ridiculous, at least from somebody watching from elsewhere. Then we have the person being moved from one place to another that really didn't have to be moved from one place to another, murdered in front of 200 million people, maybe.
That's right, and there were no fingerprints on the rifle, and the palm print was lifted. Questionably, they had trouble where that came from, and there was no physical evidence to link him to the murder, and he said he didn't do it.
Well, this is an interesting thing. So from this particular thing that happened within the United States, you got an interest into the power structure or the excesses of the ruling class, so to speak, how they could hide these sort of things.
Well, I got that, but in November or October, I guess it was around. Do you want to take a break now?
We'll take a break.
Okay, you tell me. Around November, when the Warren Commission volumes were sent to me, I got the 26 volumes, and I read Volume 1, Witness 1, that was Marina Oswald, and then I knew something. By the time I got to page 30, I knew this whole set of volumes was lying. I mean, it was just amazing. So when I just reached Volume 9, and it was George de Mohrenschildt, happened to be Oswald's closest friend.
We'll be back with more on the Kennedy assassination after these messages. Welcome back to the KMFO Forum. Today's guest, Mae Brussell. And we're talking about the Kennedy assassination. Now we got to Volume 9 of
Real quickly, before we go on another subject, Volume 9, which I just happened to pick up in my hands and look through, was this George de Mohrenschildt, who was the Nazi during World War II, whose father was in charge of the Baku oil fields for the Tsar, a very prominent person with the monarchy, the Tsars in Russia and so forth, who was in American intelligence, who provided Oswald with his homes and jobs and everything. And as I got into the Nazi connection, and all of Oswald's friends in these 26 volumes were admirals and generals, and the chief of security for the Convair, the F-111, Max Clark and Gally Clark, I began to study simultaneously at the same time the arrangement of Nazis that were brought to this country during, before, and after World War II. And that opened up my Nazi and my Vatican connection 20 years ago. I had jumped the gun on people that are now making the connections, because I could take the relationship of Oswald and his associates and put it to a larger perspective.
Well, Oswald, of course, everybody thought was communist-inspired, having spent so much time in Russia and also having a Russian bride. So now we're saying, no, he's really right-wing, he's Nazi, or at least supported by same.
Well, the far right-wing, like in the Soviet Union, when he went over there the first time, the first American that he was with, an associate, was Priscilla Johnson. And when Oswald was dead, Priscilla took Marina to Sedona, Arizona, and a large mind control job was done on her. And Priscilla is the one whose home Svetlana Stalin stayed with when she left the Soviet Union. These are people from the highest level of the Defense Intelligence Agency and intelligence that worked with Lee in the Soviet Union and then in the United States, that were all CIA, FBI, and Defense Intelligence.
Now, in mind control, you're speaking of something similar to what we saw in the movie The Manchurian Candidate.
Yeah.
And having heard some of your tapes, we have referred to other people that have been under mind control whose behavior was caused by same. We'll get into that a little bit later. But first, let's get into the situation after the Kennedy assassination. And then, of course, there was the other assassination,
Robert Kennedy and
Martin Luther King. Were these all predicated on the same item?
Yeah, there was the same motive, because Richard Nixon had been handpicked from Navy intelligence days. If you go back to that, Jerry Voorhees just died this week, and Richard Nixon was handpicked by the same gang, and he lost to Kennedy. So it was necessary to kill John Kennedy, get Nixon back on the track. And in 1968, Robert Kennedy, who again was opposing Richard Nixon, and he had to be killed because Nixon was the selected heir, according to my 20 years research, until Reagan could take over, and Reagan was selected. I would be lecturing at colleges all around the country in the 60s about Reagan being president of the United States, and at the Elgin Theater in New York and different places, and they just couldn't believe that Reagan would be president of the United States. They said, it's Nelson Rockefeller, who's this woman saying these things? I said, Reagan is the selected heir of the same team, and Nelson was deep sixth, and we got Reagan, and now we're on the brink of World War III.
Well, let's get back to the other subject now. We're talking about Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
After somebody, evidently, the only motive I can think of in that particular item was the effect of taking a pacifist out of the racial situation, so it would be more violent.
And also he was exposing the war in Vietnam and his friends over there, and he was anti-war. You know, he's becoming international and lining up with other countries against what we were doing in Southeast Asia. He wasn't just he was nonviolent on an international scale.
And of course, it's been proven that J. Edgar Hoover hated his guts.
Yeah, so. But see, what came out later was that J. Edgar Hoover, for years before and after the war, was vice president of Interpol, which was set up by Adolf Hitler and Heydrich and all of Hitler's top team. It was international police of Gestapo, and J. Edgar Hoover was vice president.
You brought into this conversation earlier the fact that there is a connection between the Vatican and what's going on. Is there any connection that you can see between these assassinations and the Vatican?
Yes. You see, the whole issue really goes down to when the Soviet government came into power. The powers that be were outraged by two things. One, that the monarchy, the Tsar, was kicked out because he was a cousin of all the ruling monarchies, his family in Europe. And they also became an atheistic nation. And the church does not want to deal with atheism. And when the Soviet Union came in, it was the immediate target of all people who have a lot of money and weapons to conquer that Antichrist figure. And that has been our entire consuming desire, not to let them be what they want, but to put Christ back in Russia. And that has taken all of our money, our weapons, our bankruptcy. It's bankrupt every country in the world.
Well, this situation, all except the Vatican, they seem to be doing pretty well if they can get the right money managers. They've had a little problem that way.
Yeah, but see, the Vatican, if you read the book, The Popessa, the woman that lived with the Pope Pius XII, he was funding to the tune of millions of dollars he was given by Mussolini, I forget the figure, 400 million, to not, or more, to not object to what fascism was going to do. Okay, and they put Franco in, and Adolf Hitler was in Germany, and Popessa describes being in Berlin before the Pope was the Pope, and he was the Archbishop there, and Hitler handing him money. Hitler was funded by the Vatican, and Mussolini was funded by the Vatican, and Franco, because they were going to keep the Roman Empire going. See, the problem, do you know what the Sovereign Military Order of Malta is?
I've heard of it, but I don't know what it is.
I thought it was something really funky and outdated until I began to really study it. The Vatican, from the year 1000, has had two branches, the religious and the military. And when you're knighted into the Knight of Malta, you swear that the Vatican is your goal to preserve the Church of Rome. William Casey is a Knight of Malta, William Buckley, James Buckley, Mr. Volpe, Secretary, all of our cabinet, and William Simon. They have a vow, and they go once a year, Alexander Haig, that the Roman Empire is even over the American Constitution. Once they're knighted, they have a vow to fight for the Roman Empire.
You're talking about the Knights of Malta.
Knights of Malta. It's called the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, and they're knighted, J. Peter Grace from the Cross Commission, all the top people running our government. So there isn't a separation of church and state anymore, because the CIA and the Defense Department and the cabinet members are knighted by the Pope, and then are to deliver the Roman Church to the world.
Well, now, let's ask about a couple other organizations. Two that I know of, one called the Trilateral Commission and the other called the Club of Rome, which seem to not to be in that ilk. They seem to be one-worlders.
Yeah.
Is there a connection?
Well, the Trilateral is building up. It's Japan, Germany, and the United States to fight Russia. You can worry about the religion later. Nelson Rockefeller and David Rockefeller, who started the Trilateral, are Protestants, but they put in the money to the Vatican, and William Donovan of the OSS was a Knight of Malta. James Angleton is a Knight of Malta. All of the major decisions of the espionage establishment are Knights of Malta, so that it's even greater than the Trilateral.
Well, how about the Club of Rome?
Well, that is a combination like the Bilderbergers. Miss Prince Bernhard is the head of the Bilderbergers. That was formed by the Knights of Malta. Again, the man who formed it was knighted by the Vatican. The Club of Rome has many Knights of Malta in it. So that you're dealing with an organization that very few people have even heard about, but it's in the paper. The Knights are knighted in May, St. Patrick's in New York, the Americans, and the others in other places. I have a list of the people who were knighted last year. And they give it on feathers and caps. They dress like the Middle Ages, and they get into these old costumes. I thought it was just sort of a figure of speech, kind of a ritual.
Well, of course, you know, the Knights of Columbus do the same thing. They wear those funny hats.
But this is a different thing, because they're making policies for the whole country.
Well, I see.
Now, somebody has this here. Should we talk?
Yes, let's talk about that.
Okay.
In other words, in the last invasion the United States made, the big invasion in Grenada, you know, where we defeated all those heavy arms.
Oh, that was very important, yeah.
We left the press out, and the press was a little bit jealous about being left out. Now, I understand that there's a new deal, that they're going to have an alert for members of the press, so if we decide to invade some other large country like Grenada, we have a
Cuba,
press corps
Nicaragua,
to go
Russia,
right in.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, what I think is that this is the first time any president's ever tried that, and I did a lot of work on the Grenada. First of all, it's the first American blitzkrieg, where we came absolutely and swept them and took the country. Reagan is asking now for $40 million for Grenada. It's the first time the Americans showed their Nazi helmet. All American Army wear Nazi helmets now. Did you know that?
Oh, I hadn't seen.
At Fort Ord, yeah. That's where they brought in the Nazi helmet. Every American in the infantry wears a Nazi helmet.
We got a call. We
Okay.
have Joan on line 2.
Oh, and then we'll go back to Grenada.
Joan, you're on the air.
Hi. I don't really have a question about the Knights of Malta, and I think I'd like to change the subject a little bit, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Okay, there are 2 articles that I noticed recently. One of them had to do with the United States Army planning a special media pool that would go around on invasions, and another one had to do with more local piece of news about the light infantry of the Army, their new infantry division. I'm not too familiar with Army terms, being moved to Fort Jerome, which is one of the most remote outposts near the Canadian border in this country in upper New York State, instead of at Fort Ord, conveniently enough, where there might be a lot of protest around their activities. And I would like to know whether Mae Brussell thinks, in relationship to these little things that keep coming out every now and then, if indeed we are living in a country which is preparing for war.
Yes, we are preparing for war. Getting back to the media pool and the invasion, because it's very important, the reason there were no people allowed on that island for 5 days, 3 days, and then by invitation for 2 days, is that we hit a mental hospital where there were 100 to 200 people, and it was targeted, and I did extensive research on the bombing of that, and I believe that we were doing medical experiments at that hospital on mind control. We have places all over the Caribbean. In fact, Maurice Bishop suspected that people killed in Chile, their corpses were being sent to the medical school there for working on, and people in this hospital were bombed out. And the important thing was to bomb that hospital and get rid of all those bodies before any troop or any person could come in. And the Americans had no mention of the casualty until McLean newspaper up in Canada, reporter happened to be at the island, and 3 days or 5 days later said, wait, the mental hospital was bombed. And I collected every article from around the country and around the world, and it seems they quickly buried the people right on the spot at the place, and they dug them up and took them to a mass grave, and then a man said he was forced to remove them, and they dumped them in the ocean and fed them to the sharks. Now, as far as the media, the reason we can't have the media there, and we've had them in every war, and they're willing to die alongside the soldiers, is that they target particular places like this, and they don't want you to see what they're doing. And because the island was left without media, there were huge 130s going over from Barbados to Grenada, and they could plant a stockpile of weapons all in boxes and say, look why we had to come, because this is what Bishop had. They could bring in stuff and plant it as well as
Well, what made that funny was the boxes of the weapons I saw were 1903 Mausers. Anybody would give that to their people to support themselves. Were committing suicide
well, they were
to the
old
people.
things from World War I, but why would Maurice Bishop even want those things around? Why would they, if they're going to have shortage of dollars, why buy that?
Well, I understand that. Now, the other thing, so that the listener understands, a light infantry division or a light infantry regiment, the difference between that and a regular one is the fact that a regiment is the smallest unit in the Army that can move by itself, has all that stuff, and they're making them smaller and smaller for quick strike. So that evidently that's what they're trying to do, make a quick strike and put them in Fort Drum, New York, you said.
Well, no, that's up near Alaska. They're going to put them up
I
there.
see.
See, what Reagan is doing is absolutely planning. Well, at least he was planning until Monday. I don't know if any of you saw the Today Show, but Monday morning, it was NBC was the scariest thing to hear the Soviet foreign minister talking, and they asked him, Brian Gilmore, somebody asked him about the next war, would it be atomic war? And there was this long pause, I mean really a scary pause that you don't hear on the network like that, and he said, yes, it would be atomic war. And they said, will it be the last war? Will there be other wars after that? And he waited again, and there was an interpreter, and he said, no, this is going to be the last war.
After this, we'll talk some more.
And the next morning, okay.
Back again to the KMFO Forum. We're talking to Mae Brussell, and we're talking about conspiracy. And I think the latest conspiracy, which is really scary, is the media pool we were talking about before the break.
Absolutely.
When you say you're going to take people up and we'll try this whole thing out, And if you report the way we want you to, we'll let you go back and see another one. That's scary.
That's what they said. I got the whole report of what the investigative work was, and they said, we will have like a mini war. We will try it out, and we'll see how you report it. And if you report it right, you can be on our pool. Well, you know, last week we had 30,000 people, or 50,000 in a war, practice war down in the desert out near Bakersfield. They spent $35 million on ammunition. Did you know that last week?
Well, it doesn't take much ammunition.
$35 million. Well, then they test the pool, see, and if they report it right. We had hand-picked media. You got NBC or ABC or CBS. You had with the Kennedy assassination, the Korean airline, the Jonestown. When the hand-picked people do it, then it takes individuals like myself or other people to write books, write articles, even this fellow from the Foreign Service who wrote about the Korean airline in Nation magazine. We individuals have to come in and show how their hand-picked are part of the team. Since when do they decide when we fight, and they decide what we know about it?
Well, that's the part that worries me, deciding what we know about it. And the Korean airliner was probably, which is, a little over a year ago, was probably one of the things that nobody told us anything about.
Yeah, and within 5 days, I had begun extensive work and wrote an article on it within a month. But, you know, they say if they decide what we see, and they're the ones who do it, then their version is the only one. What right do they have to say, if they have a reason to invade a country, then any press person, whether it's the People's World or the Free Press or anybody, should have a right to see that what they did was justified. We're paying the bills. We're already in debt at almost, $1 trillion. We're paying for it.
I understand this. Well, further than that, the press should be free. It should
be free. And this administration is the worst in history, because now it would be like, say, if Hitler goes into Poland and he says, nobody but my press, which is what happened, we have to do this because some Poles invaded our territory. It turned out they were Germans in Polish uniforms, and that started World War II. The Reichstag, the same thing. You say communists set it off. It rounds up 30,000 people and puts them in jail and never got out, and it's only their press reporting it. When is this country going to stop? It's the Nazification of America. It really is uniform and press.
Well, our numbers here are 688-5804 and 475-5527. If you'd like to join our conversation, please call. Let's talk about something else. An interesting thing this year, on the 1-year anniversary of the Korean Airlines crash, Big Splash. It also, for your information, was, 1939 to 1984, the 45th anniversary of the start of World War II, and it wasn't even mentioned.
Yeah.
September the 1st was the day that the Nazis walked into Poland.
That's right.
And this situation, I wonder, that's probably the largest Holocaust that ever happened to the world, and it wasn't even mentioned. So we're not even remembering.
80 million, yeah.
I mean, we're not just talking about Jews murdered in camps. We're just talking about how many people were affected by this terrible thing.
Walking the earth today with that.
And we've established from this war a division called the Iron Curtain, a bunch of other things, that I'm afraid that if we don't soon recover from it, we're going to have a nuclear war that'll mean we don't need a recovery. We'll all be dead.
Yeah, well, that is the goal, is to get back the territory. Now, Ronald Reagan and the president of Germany and all of them have maps published of the boundary of Germany, which is the 1937 boundary. And the purpose of the Iron Curtain, you know, they're yelling now about the Yalta Agreement not being kept. It wasn't intended. But when Stalin signed that Yalta Agreement with Churchill and Roosevelt, he didn't know that Allen Dulles and William Donovan were sitting in Switzerland working with Hitler's top agents for 2 years to get ready to invade Russia the next time. He didn't know. They knew some of that in a book, The Plot Against the Peace, Michael Sayers and Albert Kahn say, and by March of 1945, 2 months before the war was over, they printed the plans for World War III.
Well, the plans for World War III have been kicking around for a long, long time. For example, let's just take the modern weapons that we're using. We're right now in a argument about whether the B-1 bomber, which, by the way, was designed in 1957 or 1958, and the MX missile, which, by the way, is no different than the Minuteman.
Yeah.
And we're putting all this money into those things, and it looks to me, having been in both of those, in weapon systems myself over a period of time, that all we are doing is preparing so we can make a second strike. Now, my question is, what's going to be left after the first strike?
Well, I don't know if it's going to be a second. There was a story in New Times magazine that comes out of the Soviet Union saying that it's titled "Reagan's Ready to Go All the Way," and it just gives three figures: $70 billion for the MX missile, $18 billion for 9,000 cruise missiles. Those are dollars, and $1 trillion for the Star War program. Imagine what this country would have if you took the $70 billion and the $18 billion. That's $97 billion, and $1 trillion on that. How many billions are there in $1 trillion?
There's 1,000 billions.
Oh, 1,000. Okay. What are we talking about?
Well, we're talking, I guess, about what Eisenhower warned us about, the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, but he waits until he puts Nixon as vice president. Nixon's entertaining Nikolai Malaks of the Iron Guard and all the top Nazis. He sits there for 8 years and gives them all the go-ahead, and then to be a hero, he leaves the office with a speech. It's like Harry Truman forms the CIA, brings in Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, and then all of a sudden when he's leaving office, he says, well, I didn't mean to create a Gestapo. They look so liberal at the end of their term. They go home with high pensions and leave us with what they build.
Well, this situation now, let's get back into the situation for the next segment, and we're going to be taking a break here in a minute, and we're going to talk about the modern religious politics, the politics of religion.
War. It really is a holy war.
Well, we're worse than that. We're in a position, if we can't persuade them, we'll legislate them.
Yeah.
And we'll be back after these. I'm going to test the microphone, Mae.
Okay.
I'm pleased to announce I just signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes. Now, I can say that, and it's a joke. But when the President of the United States says that, it's pretty damn serious.
Particularly when he's allocating these billions and trillions for that purpose.
And then he says he's going to have a meeting next week with the foreign minister of Russia.
Yeah. Well.
And how do you come up with something like that? How do you apologize for that?
Well, I'll tell you what happened. I just mentioned that program on Today when I heard this talk about the war, and it's the first time I've ever heard anything like that. And by Tuesday morning, the president had said, "I'll meet with Mr. Gromyko." On Monday is when this foreign minister said there won't be any more wars. This is it. And Reagan had been building up. See, what he had been doing was building up that the president of East Germany would go to West Germany and that they would negate the Yalta Agreement. In fact, Reagan had already given self-entry to 3 countries in Eastern Europe. Can you imagine that? And then so they were building this thing up, ready to boil. And the Soviet Union called Mr. Honecker back and said no, and the Bulgarian president went back no. And Reagan is still boiling this because this was to be the break with the Eastern Europeans, the Hungarians, the Czechoslovakians, and so forth. So this was building up, and when we got to that point by Monday, and the conference had been called off between the two Germanys, the trying to make this merger. And when the head of the Soviet Union said that, truthfully, I've never been scared in 20 years of research, but you can't read it the same in the paper as when you hear it, like when the president says that. It doesn't sound the same when you see it. And when I heard that, I thought, well, what am I doing? I'm fixing my material, for Monday night program, my tapes and things. I've got 4 children, and I never even visualized what it's like to have all your flesh burn off, that these people are talking it. They've talked it for years. This is all they've thought about. And it was really scary. And then the next day, the president was forced to invite, suddenly, this man who's never been allowed to see him in 4 years. And I think he's going to have to put the brakes on this talk. In fact, I brought in some articles this week. The next day, there's Honecker cancels his visit. The Bulgarian leader calls off the Bonn visit. Then all of a sudden, within one day, this is the following day, on Tuesday, Reagan hoping to reassure Russia, invitation to Gromyko. Gromyko's offer to Reagan, Gromyko to meet, and they'll continue their talk. And then another article Reagan putting more emphasis on better relations with Soviets. That was exactly, by Wednesday, he became a person who nobody, even in the Pentagon, wanted the responsibility, I don't think, for starting World War III. They're not ready, they don't want it.
The interesting thing about the comment about the bombs, by Reagan,
Yeah.
it was almost on the anniversary of the atom bombing of Japan.
In August, yes, that's right.
And so you look at the thing from that perspective, you wonder where people are thinking.
But you see, you have to know Reagan, he didn't mean that to be not heard on the microphone. In the American Army base, this is from the Monterey Herald, it was an AP story this week, on the Army base, they started printing posters for the U.S. Army, colored posters for U.S. soldiers saying, "We came to kill Russians." And they said that they were inspired by Reagan's superpower joke at the microphone test, that they began printing. Not only do they have new maps of Europe ready, but on the basis of that, they were distributing and printing these colored posters, "We came to kill Russians." And it was based on Reagan's mic test. Nothing happens accidentally for Ronald Reagan. He usually says, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," or "Mary had a little lamb." He's infantile. You know the man is infantile. He's jelly beans and balloons, and infancy or a holy war. Those are your two choices, the cradle or the grave. And in between, he doesn't care. But the point is that that mic test was meant as a message for re-election to the people that want a strong president, like, "I won't back down to them. Give me the money and I'll do it." He meant that.
Well, my question there is, we'll get back to something else. It seems to me that the Republican platform is a group of excesses that nobody would ever buy. So he evidently thought that he had it wired anyway, so he could put anything in that platform you want.
They'll not only buy it, but he's way ahead in the polls, and people love it. You see, what Reagan does is he taps into the subconscious of what people really want. What they don't say on the front, like, you don't know anybody who's anti-Semitic, and you don't know any racist, and nobody who hates blacks, but he says what they want and feel, and that's where he has his power, is that he says it, and they give him all the money and the energy, and this patsy white Congress will give him anything he wants, from Tip O'Neill to Ted Kennedy and all, because he represents their clubs, their golf courses, their college roommates, their sororities and fraternities. He is America, and since we chase the Indians, we've been chasing people, whether it's the blacks, the civil rights people, civil liberties people. That's why he does it. It doesn't make him weak, and that platform is what they want.
In other words, you believe that the American people really want, for example, a constitutional amendment against abortion?
I think the American people who have any money, who go to the polls and vote, the middle class, the poor, are not united enough to get off their asses and go vote. They can afford an abortion, so it doesn't matter where they go. When abortions weren't legal or prohibition wasn't there, they got whiskey, and they didn't have to use coat hangers to get an abortion. They got abortions. Anyone with a buck can get it. It's just the poor that suffer, and the poor won't get out of bed and vote.
How about the prayer in school issue?
They don't care, because the country is basically a Christian country. The Jews have played into the hands of these people to try and get their acceptance, like they helped support Hitler. And what he is saying is appealing to the amount of people who have the money to put the votes in, to buy the television time and buy his balloons.
Okay, so those are two of the constitutional amendments, one to ensure school prayer.
Yeah.
And the other one, of course, is to anti-abortion. These would be very, very hectic for somebody who had a close race because you could use those two things against them.
But he knows the Democrats won't.
Okay, let's take the Equal Rights Amendment, of which he's much against. Now, we know that 67% of the people, the last poll that was taken, were for the Equal Rights Amendment.
Well, why do they put a Congress in that turns it down?
Well, the Congress didn't. It was the legislatures of the various states. And now people took some action, wouldn't have conventions there, and a few other things, which Mr. Reagan claimed was unfair and an unfair embargo of those states. Now, my question is, how do women, in those three issues I'm talking about, how does a thinking woman vote for a party that has a platform that's so negative to them.
You give too much credit. There's a contradiction when you say a thinking woman. It's like saying the intelligence agency. Some women think. There are a lot of women who are women biologically who say, oh, I like Gary Hart and I don't like Mondale, so I'm not going to vote. They make Reagan president, and he knows they're dumb. He knows they won't vote.
Well, we'll be back after these messages. Back to KMFO's Forum with Mae Brussell. Let's just talk about something else. For years and years and years, an emissary to the Vatican was a no-no. This was recognizing a church-state relationship. All at once we have one.
That's right.
Why?
Well, it's a combination of things. You see, just when we make our envoy to the Vatican is the time when all these books are coming out exposing the Vatican. Paul Marcinkus, the banker for the Vatican, with his stock swindles, is the book of Vatican, the Vatican Connection, in God's Name. The Vatican is linked to the organized crime syndicate and the mafia. When you have people like William Casey and Paul Oswald who have links to Vesco and the Las Vegas skimming money, Reagan is so tied into the recycling of, say, Klaus Barbie's cocaine with his administration and the Shah of Iran with Richard Nixon, and Nixon with Michael Sindona of the Vatican. The Vatican, the mafia, and the CIA are one. And Reagan uses Wilson, this William Wilson, was the man in charge of Reagan's personal finances, and he's a bag man. Wilson was just exposed recently for interfering in the investigation of Mark Rich, who owns international swindler with 90 or $70 million of taxes due, and he won't come back to this country. He owns 50% of 20th Century Fox in Pebble Beach. The Vatican was intercepting in the investigation of Marcinkus and the mafia. He's there covering the trouble spots of the Vatican mafia money because it links to Reagan. So they had to have a man in the Vatican who goes every day to cover the trouble spots. Okay, let's take another situation, another subject entirely. Archbishop John O'Connor of New York and his indictments of both Governor Cuomo and the vice presidential candidate concerning abortion. From the average person hearing it who's not Catholic like myself, it would appear to me that the Catholic hierarchy is trying to make the members be beholden to them for all of us. In other words, we're saying that if I cannot persuade people to go my way, I'll legislate. But that's exactly what the Knights of Malta is. It's his place on Fifth Avenue where they're knighted. It was Cardinal Cook's home before he passed away, and O'Connor came in. That's exactly the way the Vatican has ordered the Knights of Malta, because they're not born Catholics alone. They take the oath that they obey the Pope before anybody else. Now, the Pope is the head of this religion, family, and property. Pope John Paul II was down in Brazil, and then there were these riots. He says that if you own property, if there's 14 families in El Salvador that own all the land, the El Catorce, that's what the whole fight is about. It belongs to them. It's God's right if it was yours. Now, this is what you're up against, is that any liberal theology that says that some people in El Salvador should own land besides the El Catorce, the hell with it. That's exactly the orders come out, get out of the church. You can't be a priest down there. The priests are being killed. Well, the priests, for example, they call I guess they call it revolutionary theology, has just been brought up. The fact that they are Marxist, that is to say, that is socialist. Now, my question about Marxism, I always ask the question because when I read Das Kapital and the manifesto, it seemed to me that he viewed communism as an anarchy. No government was needed. I don't know if you've ever read it, but that's what it says. Yeah. Well, you know, there's all of the problems today really are not based on that. It's based on dollars and profits and using the church to rationalize what you have is yours, and anybody who wants to make changes in society is then for a communist. There's gradations of communists, you know. That's why they want the Tsar and the Tsarina back on the throne of Russia, that any change, even though that everyone has a house there, everyone has full employment, medical care, careers, that's not good enough. It should be back with the pogroms and the czars. But the danger of Reagan getting involved with the envoy has to be because, see, John Paul II has been charged with complicity in covering up the murder of the 30-day Pope. This fine fellow was a Pope. This book by Yallop's on the bestseller list, and they go on their way. He goes the holy man in Canada, and all of his people, the 6 people responsible are named in his book for murdering that other Pope. 5 of them are dead, and 1's alive, or yes, I think that's the batting average now. Marcinkus is alive. There's 2 alive and 5 dead, or something like that, out of the gang, or 2 to 4, I forget. But there are hardly any alive that were mentioned. They're all dead, those people. These scandals of the link of the United States CIA, of the Mafia, and the Vatican has to be covered daily. And that's why William Wilson is there, to keep the lid on these cases so it doesn't come to what we think is a constitutional government, which isn't anymore.
The constitutional government as we know it, in other words, what we're trying to say is these people are trying to stop us from being a pluralistic society at all.
Then they're doing a good job. If you can invade countries, take them over, select your press and radio and who's heard and seen, and make the decisions of how the National Guard will take over the military, all judicial appointments in lieu instead of the President and Congress. These things are just in the news now. The Vatican and the CIA and the Mafia have worked together. And the reason we have to protect the Mafia is that our banks and real estate investments would go bankrupt. It's $400 billion a year in our banks in this country, and we can't afford to even stop the drug traffic.
Well, I guess you're right. Well, let's get back to something else. I remember when Richard Nixon was president, and there was a pair of brothers named the Smothers that were on CBS, and Richard Nixon was able to take them off CBS because he really didn't like what they were talking about.
Forever.
Forever.
You only hear them just forever. He blacklisted people that forever. And it's still going on with those computers. There are people that do not get parts, producers that do not get to make movies. They put Alexander Haig on the board of MGM, and he comes out with that new movie against the Soviet Union. Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger are on the board of 20th Century Fox. They're taking over the picture studios like Hitler did in Germany.
Well, it gets pretty obvious the pictures aren't very good anymore.
No.
It's sort of like recordings. Nobody seems to be able to sell them. They said because of pirating, but could it be because the recordings are no good? Now, that's always been my question. Now, getting back to other subjects. So, generally speaking, after this hour today, we can really say that there are people that want to keep a certain status quo in the world and want to keep the poor poor and the rich rich and keep it just like it is at any expense.
There are 2 factors. There are people who want to keep it that way, and they're in the minority. They don't control, even though they control stocks and bonds and Wall Street, they're in the minority. Then there are the Indians, the blacks, the Jews who would suffer, the middle class, the working class people who are given choices that split the party, like Eugene McCarthy, John Anderson, Gary Hart, that don't get enough energy. They're influenced by the media, the few holders have. They're so influenced by the stories on Grenada or Jonestown or Kennedy assassination that they can't make a good judgment.
Thank you, Mae. It's been a wonderful afternoon. Our time has run out, and we'll see you again next week on KMFO's Forum. Our producer today, Gene Kress. This is John Arlen.